John Rapley and Peter Heather. Welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for inviting us. It's really kind of you. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciated your book, a very short book, Why Empires Fall, which I think in the current moment, you can't seem to get moved for commentary about this being the end of Western civilization or the end of America or all of those things. And I suppose that does happen periodically. I mean, over 100 years ago, Oswald Spengler wrote The Decline of the West. And yet in 1999, as you both point out in the opening of your book, Bill Clinton is giving a triumphant speech less than 9 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, saying the possibilities for America and the liberal world order are limitless. And yet you draw comparisons with the penultimate period of the Roman Empire in the West, where the Roman emperor at the time gives a similarly triumphant speech about the opportunities available to the empire, and yet not long after, it dissolves into the various warring states that it becomes. Why do you think that we are witnessing perhaps a rhyming moment in history, today's civilizational decline as it is seen being similar to the Roman empires?
I'll just throw in a little backstory and then answer the question. And the little backstory is this, that John and I first started talking about this a long time before the book appears. The book has had a long gestation period as we thought about how to do it, because it's, we're both agreed on the central idea behind it. And that's the answer to your question. I'll come to that in a minute. But working out how to do it in practical terms took a long time. But the point of putting in the backstory about how long it took us to get there is that we're talking about this in the early to mid 2000s to start with and on, before all the, manure hits the air conditioning as far as the current political discourse is concerned. I'm not claiming huge prescience, it's not shamanistic powers or anything like that. It's just actually there's a structural argument here, and that's the thing that interests John and I, and that we found in common between the two eras that we work on. John working on the modern period and me working on the late Roman and early medieval European context. And the central thesis of the book is that big imperial systems, and you have to think about them as systems with moving parts, change the world in which they operate. And they change the world around them as well as they change themselves. Both things are changing, but people react to the different stimuli that imperial systems offer to the world around them in ways that will eventually make it more difficult for that imperial system to exercise the same level of dominance that it exercised when it first came into existence, when it first began to operate it. And that's our central thesis. In other words, empires create their own, at least, they don't have to create their own collapse, but they will cause a diminution in the level of regional global power that they exercise because they transform the world around them. And that's what we're trying to argue in the book. That's the big argument, which we think has a lot of legs in it, if I summarize it.
Yeah, I think what I would add to that, John, is that what Peter and I think that looking at very different time periods, and Peter being a scholar of antiquity, of the late Roman Empire and early Middle Ages in Europe, and me being somebody who's sort of, my career has been based on this study of the global periphery. I'm a development economist. So we come to this with a similar perspective, which is that we're both, as it were, students of the periphery, and that's we've been since we started out. And I think that what kind of struck us in this conversation we were having in, I think it was around 2005. We've known each other since the early 90s when we were both young academics at Oxford. And this was sort of a random conversation when we were talking about each of the books we'd just written. Peter had just finished, or was just putting the finishing touches on what would be his bestseller on the fall of the Roman Empire. And I'd just written a book on contemporary globalization. And so we're talking about totally different, what are you doing now? What are you writing? And we're talking about totally different topics. What we were struck by is this resemblance that we had looked at the rise, in my case, of the modern West, and Peter is the rise of the Western Empire, and the way in which it transformed the periphery in such a way that ultimately in the later stages, the periphery actually moves from being, the dependent variable, if you will, to being the mover. It is there where the change is beginning, and a change that is largely missed by the scholarship which focuses on the core, if you will. In Peter's case, the legacy, not among historians so much anymore, but among those armchair historians who use Roman history to explain what's happening in the modern world, and a focus on, the sort of the Gibbon interpretation of history, which is internal decay. And Peter says, this is nonsense. This is not what's driving the process. It's what's happening in the periphery. And that was very similar to my argument that I was starting to make then about the changes that are taking place in the world economy. And I won't claim prescience, but I did say in 2000, book I published in, I think it was 2006, that, there will be a financial crisis and recurring financial crises in developed countries because of changes that are happening again in the periphery. So we said, it could be there's an actual, recurring theme in history here that and Peter was the one who really came up with the idea of a life cycle. Could it be that, you sort of, the very thing which makes you rich is ultimately which comes back to undermine you, the exploitation of the periphery. We sort of pursued this idea and came up with essentially a political economic explanation for the life cycle of empires, which is, they grow rich and powerful off the exploitation of the periphery, but in the process of exploitation, inadvertently lead to the development of the periphery until it can ultimately sort of begin to first withstand and ultimately roll back the dominance of the core. And so we just pursued that. And we, as Peter said, we were looking at various ways of writing this book and experimenting with different models. And it was actually my agent who said, when Tim Snyder's book on democracy came out, he said, what about just putting out a short idea book, rather than develop a systematic argument and get into endless arguments with, I'd be constantly arguing with the economists that it wasn't good economics. And Peter would be constantly arguing with the medievalists that, oh, you've missed this and that. That what we're suggesting is an idea that is relevant to anybody looking at the rise and fall of cores and peripheries throughout history, not just this particular one. Although this, when people ask, but why should we even study Rome? I always come back, why are we surprised that in the Western world, Rome exercises such a fixation? Our political, legal, linguistic, traditions all emerge from the fact that in one way or another, all Western countries had some kind of legacy that has shaped us. And we're always mindful. In that sense, you could take a histoire de la très longue durée view of this and say that, this is a 2,000 or 3,000 year cycle. We don't go that far, but you could. And, the civilizations themselves rise and decline. And of course, what we argue in the book is that decline doesn't necessarily in the modern period. The big difference is it doesn't have to mean fall, but it could with the wrong choices.
When you're talking about the core of an empire or a civilization expanding and being very successful and it impacts the periphery, are some examples of that, for example, America and Britain's development of the petrochemical industry in the Middle East. And now we look at the Middle East as a very powerfully wealthy region of the world, which is dominating many of the capital markets, and perhaps even China with becoming the factory of the world. It has since managed to expand its own capacities and then start to build its own neo-imperial projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, for example.
Yes, that's exactly what we have in mind. So these things start out as imperially driven projects to benefit the imperial core, fundamentally. I mean, both the petrochemical in the Persian Gulf and the investment in China that the shift of manufacturing to China to make cheaper goods, because labor costs were so much cheaper there. They were understood that they were a kind of deal, of course. They would have benefits for the societies in which they were being generated, but the investment from the center is driven by the desire to bring benefit to the center, both in terms of investment income and cheaper goods flowing into the West. But you start that chain reaction, and you end up with China being marginally the second largest economy on the planet. And as a historian, the one thing I would always say is, which sounds very pompous anyway, it's a very simple point. Power is cash. Follow the money, you will see power. So if you change an economic balance, you are changing power structures. If you make China the second largest economy on the planet, you will make China a major global power. There's sometimes a time delay, of course, but it is only a time delay. If China is structurally going to be the second largest economy on the planet for a number of decades, then China will be the second most important global power. Straightforward.
Let's think about why you have put forward that we are witnessing this decline, this potential civilizational moment, as it were, where the West's dominance is now seriously under question. And I think you've outlined a number of different ways in which that's come to pass. And one of them we've touched on already, which is financial. And you said follow the money, and that's where the power will be. To what extent does, for example, the high national debt to GDP ratios that you see in America, Britain, France, just about any Western country you can think of, suggest that the dominance is really waning? And I think to put a finer point on that, I saw a stat over the weekend that America is now spending more on its interest payments to service its national debt than it is on military spending, which surely doesn't do anything for hard power in the long term.
Yeah, sure. I think that's an issue. I think one of the things there's a couple of things that are largely overlooked. I mean, when we talk about debt to GDP ratios, almost always when you read business journalists, they will be talking about government debt to GDP ratios. And of course, one of the things we look at in the book, which is really interesting, is look more broadly. It is household and private sector corporate debt. Is when you add that to the mix, it's on an upward trajectory, and there's no sign of reversal. But there's another element too, and that is something that we don't discuss in the book, but I've discussed elsewhere, is net public wealth. That if you look at the sort of net financial position of most Western governments, they have been running down their capital stock. I mean, one of the ways, back in the wave of privatization of public sector enterprises in the 80s and 90s, the money that was raised off the privatization of public enterprises generally was redistributed to the population in the form of tax cuts, or, sort of keeping a lid on taxes. But what has happened in the process, of course, as we know all too well in Britain, is that the stock of public wealth, just looking at the state of infrastructure in most Western countries, has been running down quite badly. And this has deleterious effects on the economy. And I think it's probably getting far too little attention. I think this is important to realize, or to highlight that, what is that debt being used for? China, for example, has a similar scale of debt. On the other hand, China has a vast network of, high-speed rail, and it is adding infrastructure. So I would say China has real problems. I don't want to minimize the problems that China faces in the future. But on the other hand, I do think that there is a sign of a sort of a forward-looking strategy in what they're doing. Whereas in Western governments, I don't detect much of that at all. Everything has become very much preoccupied with, in politics, relatively short-term visions, and of course in finance with quarterly statements. Even the way in which pension funds are required to manage their investments in most constituencies, they are required to basically maximize returns, minimize risk, but there isn't a sort of sense of in what ways are you actually investing for future generations, or are you just trying to keep your current beneficiaries in the style to which they've grown accustomed? And that requires some kind of running down of capital. So I think we're at that stage, which is a real concern, which I think is probably getting too little attention. The focus on, even if you look at, the British election campaign, and the focus on, well, we will keep taxes low, or we will keep the debt, bring the deficit down. It's very narrowly focused on a set of relatively short-term measures. But if, as has been the case in Western countries, when there has been significant deficit reduction, what you've had is a rise in private debt. That actually outstrips any saving from the public sector. You still have a problem, but you're just redistributing it.
Yeah, what we argue in the book broadly is that this increase in debt is effectively replacing the income that Western countries used to get by selling to the rest of the world. So, the economic flows of the imperial system used to bring a lot of wealth into the West. This extraordinary figure from 1999, that 80% of world GDP is made and consumed in the West. That is a staggering figure, and it's one to hold on to. If you shift manufacturing and the production of wealth somewhere else, you're going to need to replace the wealth flow within your own country, or you will have political problems, of course, unless you have a really honest political discourse. And obviously you'll have to do a mixture of the two over time. And we've certainly not had an honest political discourse about this. And we've effectively replaced it with debt. And that is going to have what it is, the chickens are seriously coming home to roost. But I would echo what John says about, political campaign. When was the last time you heard a politician say, well, the way you really make your country wealthy is by selling stuff to other people who are not in your country? Exporting is how you actually generate extra wealth within your economic domain. The 6 ways in which we make currency and get wealth from people overseas is by doing X, Y, Z, A, B, C. So we need to focus on those and get the wealth coming back into our country. I've not heard a single politician frame an argument in that way for donkey's years. There are briefing papers which talk about this kind of thing. I've seen some of them. They're not secret or anything. It's just my son brought them to my attention. But you don't hear that being talked about. That level of honesty. That actually, it's not by bulking up the hospitality sector that you will make the country wealthier. That's just pushing around stuff that's already within your economic domain. The way you make your country wealthier is by selling stuff to other people in other economic domains. Otherwise, you're just going to keep racking up the debt. That's the short-term reflex. But as John suggests, and as I think your question was suggesting, other John, I'm here talking to 2 Johns, which is not immediately straightforward. That is going to lead to a deeper crisis.
Yeah, and I know we're not here to talk necessarily about policy or what might get us out of this, but I think it is striking when you live in a place like Britain, or even if you look at some of the policies, I suppose, coming out of the European Union of late, which is tourism above all else. That's where we're getting lots of our inflow, but high energy costs mean you don't have a lot of industrial action or industrial industries remaining. And obviously in the UK, we've not had any for a long time. And as someone who's worked in and around financial services for a while, I know that is the one gravy train that Britain has, and yet even that's open to debate as to how long that will remain. In supremacy, albeit it always seems to hold its own, but that can't be the only thing, particularly as someone from
Another gravy train is actually what I do at universities. But all we get is this discourse about, oh, you've got to stop master students bringing their mothers in, rather than actually, as though it's some kind of dangerous thing to have bright, intelligent people from other countries coming to study in your country. Oh, some of them stay. That's obviously a terribly bad thing. Universities, we have a fantastic university sector. The whole world operates in the English language. This is left to its own devices. We can generate a lot of foreign income, not on the services scale, obviously, but we are another asset. But that's not because you're not analyzing the problem clearly and bringing the problem to the forefront. You end up looking at the wrong dimensions of the question and focusing on what universities can really do within the economy, which is actually be pretty useful generators of income for their size.
What cultural factors can be behind the decline as well? Presumably, elites have some part to play in this. I mean, typically that's where we can take our cues around culture, and this isn't going anywhere near as far back. Well, I suppose this bit is. We know that the West is built on Judeo-Christian principles, albeit they morphed into various secular versions of those in the last 500 years. And then since the 1960s, we've seen a staggering change in principles, social mores, and I would say people waking up who were born before that period would probably find themselves in a bit of a foreign country in that respect. How much does a cultural change lead to the disintegration, for example, of a previously cohesive civilization or culture?
I think I'll quickly answer that, but I think Peter is probably the better person because Neil Ferguson once actually tried to weaponize his his book on the fall of the Roman Empire and misrepresented it. And that, to some extent, we tried to get even by pointing out the way he's misused history and the way we're correcting him. But I would say my own view is to see culture as being more a response to rather than a motivator. So it is a signpost of change. It's not the thing that's actually driving change. And it's usually culture that those who actually try and say, look, we can learn from Roman history tend to focus on. And as Ferguson put it, basically that loss of cultural self-confidence and allowing foreigners to come in and redefine your culture, that's what really heralds the end of an empire. I think the cultural change and I think the big one, which I think bears noting, Peter pointed out the way, and we developed this argument, that in the late stages of the very final sort of decades of Roman imperial history, you get the growth of this internal division as the elites start fighting among themselves. In a sense, they're no longer living off the surplus of a periphery, so they have to internalize their exploitation. One aristocrat's gain must be another one's loss. So who's going to be the winner? Who's going to be cut off? And we warn that that's a real danger, that we reach that point, that we begin to see. And I think there is, and certainly this is one of the temptations that some, I think, opportunistic politicians in Western countries, I don't have to name names, I think we know who we're talking about, are trying to exploit this by saying, well, you're poor because this person's been allowed in. And they've taken your job, even though all the evidence is the contrary. And they, in most cases, are intelligent enough to know that it's the contrary and that they're actually lying. They find this a very resonant message because it's something one can get, it's visible. You can say, well, yeah, that's true. My living standard has gone down since these people have been showing up in my neighborhood. That seems to be the link. And so there's this kind of us and them, this division that's emerging in society. And I think that's an inevitable challenge. We argue that if throughout the 20th century, the peak of the Western age, when we argue that the empire reaches its highest level of evolution under this sort of US-led system, there's a net subsidy coming from the empire throughout that whole period. And so everybody is sort of, you've outsourced exploitation to the periphery, as it were. And so it's a harmonious society. Everybody's rising. But now that has been lost. And so if you're going to continue maintaining share values, it means you've got to outsource manufacturing to low-wage zones to boost your profits. And that means, okay, you're going to have to abandon the traditional working class. And these kind of divisions inevitably sort of begin to work in. And, and the question is, do politicians rise to it and say, we're facing real challenges. We're going to have to look at how we adjust to this new world. And again, the temptation is just too great to say, well, we'll just resist it altogether and go back to the way things were. And this is something that has to be said. Obviously, I'm thinking of, conservative politicians primarily, right-wing politicians. But, if you just look at the political debate in the current election campaign in Britain, I don't think Labour is really being honest. They're saying they'll make the economy grow. Well, you're not going to make the economy grow unless you make really tough decisions. And they're not prepared to take those because they keep sort of maintaining this idea we can somehow pull it off painlessly like we did it another time because somebody else was bearing the pain.
Yeah, I agree with what John said, of course, and we do take cabinet responsibility for everything that we put in the book. We both agree that, just to add quickly, a couple of other dimensions to it. The cultural challenges are real. You've got people from different backgrounds with different ideas of what's right and what's wrong, and you can't pretend that they aren't there. On the other hand, you do have to be much more honest. And there are 2 points where politicians and political discourse in general needs to be more honest. One is, it's not the arrival of migrants into the West that is taking away worthwhile jobs from the traditional Western working class. It is actually the transfer of production out of the West. And so, if you worry about migrants within the UK or in America or whatever, you are missing the point. That is not where the wealth has gone. The wealth has gone to China. The wealth has gone to the BRIC countries. The wealth has gone to India because that's where manufacturing has gone, where wealth production has gone. So you need to be crystal clear about that. And the other thing you need to be crystal clear about is the changing demographic patterns in the West. The fact that apart from Israel and Iceland, no developed Western population is reproducing itself. And in some places, you're way below that canonical 2.1 child per woman for a population per adult woman for a population to reproduce itself. At the same time as healthcare has got better. So we have aging populations and we have growing dependency ratios of those who are past the age of working to those who are working. And migration into the West has been very much about solving the problem of our aging population and declining birth rate. And people don't talk about that. So that's not to say there are cultural problems. That's not to say there are things that need to be talked about. But on the whole, migration into the West is helping Western economies, is doing Western populations a favor. It means that our parents are being looked after by a real person and not by robots, as they decide to be in China when they go into retirement homes and whatever. And actually, it isn't migrants into the West who are taking jobs. It is the shift of production to the developing world that has taken away the traditional access to the production of wealth that the Western working class had from the mid to late 19th century onwards. So two real points of clarity that need to come into political discourse, or you will be coming up with the wrong answers the whole time. And it does seem to me.
It is what we're seeing typically down to the focus on resource. So in this case, we know, as we've talked about, that politicians will typically talk about GDP, growing the economy, and that becomes a single point of metric in which to base their success on, and they'll do anything they can to try and grow it. And we know that high immigration can increase the GDP at the state level, even if it decreases it per capita, which isn't necessarily making other people poorer. It just means it's spread out over many more people. Is this And I think I've seen it start being used as a kind of human quantitative easing, really just covering up that there are these structural problems. And actually, instead of, for example, continuing ahead with a mass immigration policy in the hope that you can just keep on feeding people in that will fix things in the end, that we know that it will cause, unless it's in the boardroom, diversity can cause lots of social, cultural rubbing together on the neighborhood level. It seems to me that you would think about what it is to structurally fix things instead of looking to the rest of the world to bring people in when the jobs aren't there in the first place. And you as a government have a duty, I suppose, in the first instance to govern for the people already there. What would you say to that? Do you see that within empires and civilizations that as part of their success, once they're on the way and they're doing anything they can to keep it going, so they're pulling in from the periphery, but it only delays the inevitable and causes additional problems along the way?
I guess when it comes to the question of culture, because, as Peter points out, and I agree, I mean, it is a challenge. It is a challenge. Look, when we had this initial conversation about the book, it was actually, we bumped into each other one Easter holiday in the south of France, where I was then teaching at a university in the south of France. And having lived, for quite a time in France, and observed the changes that had taken place, it's visiting small villages where the last artisanal, well, call it they're not called artisanal in France. They were just bakeries where you bake the baguette from scratch. The baker got up at 3 or 4 in the morning and, prepared the dough and everything. And the closure of the last bakery, it's a very sad moment. You sort of see those things disappearing. Now, that's not entirely due to immigration, but there's no question that, this immigration does cause that. But I think, and I can quite understand that a politician would say, but we don't want to lose, or an individual voter might say, we don't want to lose our way of life. But the trade-off is they say, we don't want to lose our way of life, nor do we want to lose our material standard of living. And the question then is, how do you keep this economy growing? The other day I heard this Nigel Farage and talking about British nurses who can't get jobs because the government is importing foreign nurses. Well, there may be somewhere in Britain a nurse who can't get a job because a Nigerian nurse is brought into his or her place. But personally, I haven't met that person. And certainly in the data, the British nurses who can't get jobs aren't getting them in Britain because they're packing up and going to Australia and Canada, where they can get much more pay and less of the kind of demonization that they're getting in by the UK, by these kinds of politicians who say they're lazy and shutting down the system with strikes. We are relying on foreign nurses because it's the only thing which is keeping the health system operating. Is we talk about this briefly in the book. Without foreign nurses and foreign doctors, it would collapse. Now, you could say as a politician, we want to create a system in which you're only treated by British medics, and you could. But you'd also have to say, but we can't then treat X, Y, and Z, certain things, you'll have to go private. But because they are clinging to this idea, and it came out of this period in history when nothing seemed to have a price, everything seemed to be free. But that was because, as we argue in the book, during that period of imperial history, the price was being paid by someone else. You were exploiting somebody else's labor and generating a surplus and enabling yourself to both preserve your standard of living and your style of living. And now that imperial subsidy is gone, and you either resort to immigration to keep the economy and the public sector going, or you reason honestly with the voters and say, well, what do you want? Do you want to continue earning a pension that is as valuable as before and have your property value be as high as it is now? Or do you want the bakery to be the old-fashioned bakery where in Britain we're getting sort of jelly rolls and and the butcher who sells meat pies and all the rest of it? And I think we need that kind of honesty. But instead, what we're getting is politicians who are saying we can still have it both ways somehow. And inevitably, that brings us back to the question of debt. Well, how do they keep, in fact, supporting this system without telling people they'll have to pay more in taxes. Well, we run up debt is what we do, or we run down assets. We sort of say, well, okay, we'll reorient the public health spending towards salaries and away from proper maintenance or building or maintaining hospitals or, adding, maintaining equipment. So ultimately you do run it down by stealth rather than face up to the decisions honestly. I mean, that's kind of a roundabout answer. I don't know if that's clear, but I think we need to just to sum up, I would say, I think we need to be honest here that, we have to make a choice. We can continue to maintain our material standard of living, or we can focus on preserving our way of life. And I think we need to have that honest conversation.
I hear you, and I think they are common talking points that you hear in the political landscape. One thing that I would say, probably to try and bolster that side's argument a little bit, is particularly on the doctors and nurses point, is I know that many of the complaints seem to be grounded in the idea that effectively the union, the British Medical Association, has capped the number of doctors, nurses, places that can be trained within the British populace. And so the accusation on them is that there's a bit of a political decision there. And I know you both work in the university sector, so whilst I'm throwing some dissent out there, the international student point, I know there are those, I would say, are they on the right? I'm not too sure. I think you can find this on the left as well, where, you find it across where they'll say, okay, it's okay to have international students, but someone, I can't remember who it was, but there was something released recently which showed the difference in the entry grades for British students and international students. So not only do international students come over and have to pay so much more, but then they can get in with much lesser on the qualifications front. And so people would say, well, why is that? Why would we prioritize the international students potentially for soft power purposes and spreading influence in the future over the British populace? And then they would cynically say, and perhaps not without foundation, that it looks like an economic point, and that there are many universities, apart from the really prestigious ones, that are running a deficit, and so they're covering it up through this international student system. So I think I understand what you're saying, that these points can quickly descend into, well, we don't want it, let's cut our nose off to spite our face. But I think there's other things to it where people will say, structurally, it looks like things are stacked against British folks, whether it's through the BMA or the university system.
Correct. I wouldn't disagree. Let me just quickly make a point, Peter, and then you can take over. On the issue of universities, and Peter can tell you this, and it reaches right up to the very most elite universities. The reason they're prioritizing foreign students is because the budget coming from the government isn't sufficient to maintain these universities. The revenue is simply not there. £9,000 a year isn't enough currently to cover the cost of an education. So they are using foreign students to cross-subsidize the local ones. That's an example of what I mean. Let's be honest. Let's say, okay, well, listen, we simply can't produce as many graduates as we do because we need to reduce the number of graduates, but maintain the funding. And therefore rely less on foreign students. But rather than face that choice, it's been a convenient way for governments to, transfer the money. And the same, I would agree with the doctors. This is not a problem peculiar to Britain. There's sort of the use of a closed shop approaches, whereby you limit the number of positions available, and therefore you concoct a sort of a supply and demand imbalance and inflate the wages. I mean, doctors, I'm here in Canada at the moment, and that's, one of the reasons why doctors are so well paid in Canada. But it's leading, therefore, but again, rather than face up to this, well, it's a competitive world. Those doctors go south of the border to the US. We either have to pay them a whole lot and therefore demand more in taxes to support the system, or we accept a different, we just start saying, well, there's a lot of things we won't treat. That's an example of what I'm trying to get at, is having an honest conversation, but rather instead of doing that, and it just becomes easier to just say, well, it's because we have, foreign doctors, or the doctors are selfish, rather than saying, well, we're all being pretty selfish here. Peter?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think one might say about the university sector, well, actually, we're able to take more home students because the extra income that you can make from foreign students allows us, therefore, to teach British students that were not being paid properly to teach. And certainly, we don't have any. If you think about the massive expansion that's taken place in the university sector, you got to think about what sort of percentage of your population should go to university, in economic terms. Who are there? What sort of percentage of your population are you training for graduate level jobs? In other words, because the one thing that really annoys me, because of course, I went to university in the late 70s and early 80s when tuition was free, and I think in my day it was 17% of a generation went to university of one kind or another. Now it's $9,000 a year, and it's high 40s of a generation. But there aren't graduate level jobs for nearly 50% of the population. So you're landing these students with a kind of small mortgage level of debt, with no prospect of them having a job, and that makes taking on that level of debt at all appropriate or sensible. And I find this absolutely horrifying. So I just think again that the lack of connected thinking about what does your economy look like, what jobs have you got in what sector, what sort of training is appropriate. Britain's always been crap at things like proper technical skills, the things that Germany does better, of rating those as important as in very academic skills. I obviously have skin in the game. I think academic skills are important and help a lot in all kinds of ways, but I absolutely see that you should be not regarding technical skills as in any sense lesser, just different. What is the appropriate mix in your educational portfolio, given what your economy does and how you make your living in this planet, in this new global world in which you all operate? And do you see any connected thinking about that in political discourse? I'm damned if I do.
No, not quite. We can keep hoping. So we've spoken quite a bit about how decline comes about through the rise of the former periphery, which starts to become, in their own way, a core in itself or in themselves, and then they rub up against the previous core. It seems then that, and whether people talk about history repeating or rhyming or it's cyclical or whatever, that decline becomes inevitable in some way. From what you've seen, looking at the historical record, is there anything that has been done successfully to slow down or reverse decline? Or is it about waiting for the new to be birthed?
In our argument, we're not looking at mere repetitions, in the sense that I do think the Western imperial system, like the Roman imperial system, created the seeds of its own eventual blunting so that it couldn't keep operating in the same way. The Roman world operated with, as did most of the pre-modern world up until 1850 or later in most places, an agricultural economy where growth of any kind is very limited. You can't generate new wealth in straightforward ways. And when you reach political crisis points, it's about ownership of existing wealth. You can't, as it were, leverage your way out of it by generating new wealth so that, as it were, more people can share, and you blunt that political competition over control of wealth. in the Roman world, it eventually came down to a pretty brutal struggle for control of what was there, because you can't generate anything else. There's the good land that there is, good agricultural land that there is in Britain. You can't make more of it. You can't suddenly turn the Highlands into good farming country and solve an argument that way. That's not possible. The modern world is very different because you can generate new wealth, we hope, without destroying the climate. That is the other dimension, of course, which we're not discussing here, but one should. But new wealth can be generated. You can accommodate perfectly reasonable human aspiration across the planet by generating more wealth for more people to share, and blunt the struggle for control of assets to some extent by doing that. And the decline in the modern West is relative to the rest of the planet. It's not absolute. We are wealthier than we were in the 1950s when we ran the entire planet. So let's keep things clear as to what we're talking about. We just can't run the entire planet anymore. And actually, maybe that's a good thing, to be honest. So there are more ways forward, in other words, is what I'm saying, in the modern context. If we think clearly about what's going on, what the real trends are, why we can't run the planet anymore, then think about what do we do from here. So how do we now make our living selling stuff to the rest of the world when the rest of the world can do what Leeds, Manchester, Sheffield did in the 19th and early 20th century? They can do that perfectly well. So modern world, it would be bonkers to import raw cotton from India, turn it into clothes in the Northeast, and then send it back to India. That's what happened in the 19th century. Why would you do that? Only because India doesn't have a cotton manufacturing industry. That's why you would do it. But once development has equalized across the planet, you would not do that. Okay, so what do we do now? How do we make our living? What can we offer the world that means that people will buy stuff from us, and that we can share in the still developing wealth of the planet, and be taken seriously, hopefully, in the important discussions that have to be had about how we develop human society without destroying the planet and damaging the environment further. So there is a repetitive pattern, but it's taking place this pattern is repeating itself in a very different context. And that means where we go from here will be very different from what happened in the Roman context.
Sorry? Just to say, as we say near the end of the book, the real issue for the future of the West, is how does it engage the rising periphery? What is its relationship going to be? And of course, how does it engage with China? And that's the unanswered question. I am observing with great interest China's own approach to its own periphery, which is becoming increasingly significant. There's a saying in Kenya, when the Chinese come, they give us a hospital. When the Europeans come, they give us a lecture. And I find it really quite fascinating that China doesn't want to deal with the slowdown in its economy by bringing in immigrants. It's like Japan in that respect. It's not a great place. Foreign students who go to China are not expected to stick around after their studies. In some place, that's a good thing. If you're a Nigerian student and you're told, well, you're not really welcome here, go back to Nigeria, you take your engineering skills back to Nigeria and benefit your country. But the other thing which is interesting is that what that anecdote from Kenya illustrates, the Chinese are actually pouring a great deal of investment into the development of the periphery. And part of that is because they see it as, well, if Western countries are becoming more protectionist, where are we going to sell all these electric vehicles that we're producing? Where are we going to sell all these solar panels to these other developing countries? They're not going to be able to buy them unless their own incomes are rising. There seems to be a model emerging of sort of Chinese imperialism, which, if you will, might be a little bit more, I don't want to say enlightened, but it recognizes that there's something to be gained from the rise of a periphery. It's not just a zero-sum game. And I do think there is that kind of zero-sum thinking. The assumption is if China is rising, by definition, it's a threat to us. Now, that may be the case. I am not a sinologist, and I'm not an expert on international strategic studies. I do it, but I would never call myself an expert. But it could be that there's another model there, and we should take a step back, be a bit more humble. And part of that is, and it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable because it means that there might be areas in which we say, well, we're going to have to let the Chinese hold sway. We simply can't dominate all the seas of the world anymore. And there will be definite real moments of decision, which is, sooner or later, there will be some kind of, a point will come when Taiwan either is or is not reintegrated into China. And that simply can't be avoided, or perhaps it can be, but it will have to be avoided at great cost. And the question is, on what terms is Taiwan? It could be that we can find terms that leave everybody happy, but I think the idea that we just sort of say this is the stand we will make and we will not budge looks like we're headed towards inevitable conflict. But it may be that there is another approach to the world. There may not be. It may be that Xi Jinping is himself so imperialistic and so anxious to dominate. If you look at the way he's behaved in Hong Kong, perhaps there really isn't any hope other than a clash of civilizations. But there may be another model available, and I think it's worth actually being open to that and sort of seeing the world with different eyes and considering. Peter talks about this, or we talk about it, but it's Peter's research, obviously, in the late stage of the Roman Empire. There was a period in which they had to decide how to deal with the Persian Empire, and they decided to see it as a rival, and it's, one of us is going to win, we'll be the winner. And it's not entirely clear that was the only choice available to them, wouldn't you say, Peter?
Oh, no, absolutely. Persia and the Roman Empire coexisted for several centuries, and then internal political reasons led them both into a head-on confrontation, which basically destroyed the two of them. That's the analogy. So, when they're living with one another, they talk about themselves as the twin lights in the firmament. So that maybe we need to think about that a bit more. And I think the other thing I'd add to, whatever China does, whatever its kind of internal political weaknesses, however that drives it to behave on the planet, that doesn't vitiate actually that policy of positive engagement with the developing periphery as your new markets. We quote the statistic in the book. John, it was his statistic, you'll remember, for every pound invested in the periphery, you get more than one. How many more than £1 back do you get, John? You get several back. That it's a good thing to do. You should not be cutting foreign aid budgets. That is a bonkers thing to do, especially if you need to make your way in the world by selling more stuff overseas. You should be investing strategically overseas. That is one message that's loud and clear. And that's what China's got right, whatever it then turns out to do on the global political strategic level. That is just the right thing to do. We're in the modern world. We need places that don't hate us to buy stuff from us. So let's get on with the new world and stop kind of hankering after an old one that doesn't exist anymore and can't possibly exist.
So learning from China, it would be getting over there, actually building capacity. And I think that's sometimes where the pushback on foreign aid comes from, is are we giving cash handouts to governments where it doesn't get down to building capacity? So I don't know how the Chinese have managed to get there and build factories and all the infrastructure, but they have. And clearly it's having an impact. So clearly there's something that can be learned from there. And I suppose that the big question being is where we get the finance for it from, particularly as we talked about the high debt to GDP. You're always going to have people looking at that going, well, hang on, spend the money here, spend the money in leveling up, for example, or whatever other political policy that we've got. But yeah, clearly there is stuff to be learned from those who we've come to see as geopolitical rivals, and I suppose are in some ways. But you're right, there's a framing in there that helps with your communication and the language that you use around them, which is probably going to lead to either frostier or friendlier relations.
And it will vary, Xi Jinping he's older than I thought he was, isn't he? He's 70 something. I thought he was younger than that. He's not going to be there forever. Especially authoritarian regimes are very dependent on who's in charge at any given moment. That's another lesson from history. These things come and they go. He is not China. China is not him. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, you've talked about the question marks over the future of China, and I suppose right now they really are on the ascendant, even if there are things in the medium term like housing bubble, debt bubble, which is starting to impact them, perhaps not in the same way as the rest of us in the West at the moment. I know recently there was also that big news piece about the population, and I can't remember exactly what it's going to be, but something like half of the population will remain by the end of the century. So it's 1.2 billion now. I think the UN came out and said something like there's a population bomb. That means it'll be more like 700 million by the end of the century. And so if, for example, a lot of political economists' ideas about more people, bigger economy is true, then that's a problem. But then I know others would come and say, well, this is why everyone's trying to invest in tech, in AI, to try and make sure we can keep this whole show on the road without having to have 1+ billion people. And depending on which way you look at it, that can either be a bit of an anti-human response to things, or it becomes one which is focused on sustainability, which I know we've referenced a couple of times. John, you look like you had something to say there.
I think we have to approach this with a great deal of humility, that we are in uncharted territory. And I think one of the mistakes, in economics has been to extrapolate from a relatively brief period in human history and assume that these are the rules for eternity. The period, as we show in the book, the period after 1800 is a period of extraordinarily rapid economic growth, unprecedented in history. It is possible that it will also, it will not serve as a precedent, that it was just an exceptional period, and that we are now heading into a period in which growth, there is evidence that, the economic growth is on average almost everywhere is slowing, that most of the growth in the world economy now at the moment is due to the rising periphery, and that the relative stagnation of Western countries since the financial crisis is not, in fact, just a problem to be overcome, but actually the new norm, and that China will head into this sort of similar kind of steady state, and the rest of the world may. And I think we need to at least be open to this possibility that we're going to need an entirely new set of tools and economic models to really predict and to sort of say, well, how do we organize societies? In a society with a declining population that isn't able to rely on a magic bullet of artificial intelligence to, in fact, maintain the growth rates of the past, what do you do? Whenever I hear these visionaries talk about people living to the technology that will enable humans to live until they're 1,000 years old, I said, so does that mean retirement will be at 965? Have you thought about this? They keep thinking, well, no, we'll have 900 years of retirement. How on earth are you going to support that? These questions aren't being entertained, and they need to, because we now live in a time where people I have met have spent more time collecting a pension than they did paying into that pension. That is simply not a sustainable model. But nobody wants to actually say, well, they're talking about lowering retirement ages and increasing benefits. And how on earth do you do this? And these are the kind of questions we really need to start talking about seriously, because I think this could become more than just a local problem. This could become a human problem, because we're seeing that demographic transition throughout the world. And
did a talk in a local pub here in Oxfordshire about some of these ideas to an audience that was similar in vintage to me. I can't remember if we're on film, but I'm 64, white-haired, reasonably healthy and vigorous still, but male, pale, and hopefully not stale, definitely. And I said, the problem is not migration. The problem is old white people. That is the problem. We're not contributing to the economy. We're living way beyond where we were expected to live when the welfare state is created. I'm very happy about that as a 64-year-old male. My grandfather, just after World War II, had a life expectancy of about 4 years, where I am now, and I have way more than that, and I'm extremely happy about it. But you have to be honest, this creates an economic issue, a serious economic issue. And that economic issue has to be addressed straightforwardly and sensibly, obviously, as a 64-year-old, with compassion as well. But, you know, these are the parameters that have changed, and you have to think about what expectations are reasonable in a world with a much older population and a much smaller working population. And a world where the production of wealth has shifted to other places, so you can't just magically produce loads of wealth where you are. You know, I don't think it's an insuperable problem. I'm not consumed with despair, I hasten to add, but you have to think about the big things that have moved since 1950 and think about where the logic then pushes your response to those changes. And this is, as an analytic historian, this is what drives me to despair about modern political discourse, because I just don't see that. I just don't see that level of reflection. And if you don't give that reflection, you're not offering the electorate reasons why they have to make tough choices. And they don't make tough choices, and then the debt, as you mentioned, John G, quite rightly, the debt keeps on growing.
Well, we've talked a bit about reflection here, and a question that I like to ask all of my guests, so I'll ask you both in turn, is to reflect, actually. So we'll start with you, Peter. Have you changed your mind about in the course of your life, something you might have previously thought was a unshakable certainty, or perhaps even something you changed your mind about recently, and what was it that made you think differently?
I think the thing that has changed my understanding of the world is actually looking at demographic patterns, which I didn't really reflect on. The single most extraordinary fact that came out of the research that we did for the book, to me, I'm sure other people knew this perfectly well, but I did not, was the fact that up until about 1830 or 1840, between 30 and 50% of European children were dying in childhood. Born European children were still dying in childhood. A staggering 50% in Germany in the 1830s of children don't make it into adulthood. I checked that with one of my 19th century colleagues, and because I found that very surprising that Germany would be worse than Britain and France, where it was only 30. But I said, yeah, no, that's right, because eastern parts of Germany were very poor agricultural areas as late as 1830. That does make sense. The death rates would be even higher there. So this first demographic transition is healthcare, inoculation, etc., and all these children survive. And so between 1850 and 1900, people are still having massive families. My grandfather was one of 11 children, and they all survived to adulthood. So around 1900, you've got Europeans breeding like rabbits still, because they still think all their children are going to die, but they're all surviving. And this is the era of, obviously, Western colonization across the planet. You have far more Europeans in that era than at any other era of time, because it takes 2 generations or a generation and a half before people realize their children are surviving, and you don't have to have children anymore. And there's enough wealth so your children are not supporting you in retirement. But anyway, the great era of Western colonization is associated with that first demographic transition. But then we get the second demographic transition. And this is the thing that I think people are not thinking about clearly enough. What it means if instead of the canonical 2.1 children, your adult women are only having on average 1.5 or 1.6 children. That is a huge game changer, and it's hidden because our populations are not declining yet because better healthcare means that people are living longer. So you're not seeing it in total population figures, but it is changing the ratios within your population. And I think it's kind of understanding that has made me realize that the sort of there's two moving parts to the modern world that make it different from the world that I grew up in. One is the shift of manufacturing to the periphery, but the second is the shifting demographic pattern within our own societies. And we have to square the circle and work out where the shifting of these two things leads us. What is our best logical response to these two mega changes? And they are both mega changes.
Yeah, in answer to the question, what have I changed my mind about? I'm tempted to say I've finally given up on my annual ritual of saying next season will be Manchester United's good season. But I think for taking up where Peter left off more profoundly, this issue of the demographic transition, which is part of a series of questions we sort of only just raised at the end of the book, but we just decided it wasn't, the book didn't allow us to possibly investigate. The other one we do refer to is climate change. But this is something I give a lot of thought to, and I spend a lot of time researching and actually writing about these issues. And I think the one possibility, I've always been very dismissive, as we both have been, of those who talk about civilization collapse. Look at what happened to Rome, it's going to happen to the West. And we're saying that's utter nonsense. But the possibility of complete civilization collapse, of human civilization now, not Western civilization, is one that I'm actually being forced to entertain for the first time, because these are not insurmountable problems, but they do take human will to face, to confront. How do you maintain endless growth with a declining population? And what if, technology doesn't provide a solution? Many of my colleagues are optimists who say, don't worry, it's all going to be solved by AI, but they don't produce much evidence to that effect. It's really just an expression of hope. And I keep going back to Robert Solow's famous statement, the computer age is everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. We heard the same thing about the internet. We heard the same thing about computers. Productivity growth has been trending downwards ever since. And the kind of examples that I get of how artificial intelligence will revolutionize human productivity are based on assumptions, and also, I think, in some cases, mistaken models. They're based on a calculus-based model of human decision-making, in which you can actually create an even more intelligent human. But again, economists are not great at, researching outside their field. And a lot of the research, as I understand it, and neurobiology says, it's a lot more complicated the way the human mind operates. And there's quite a body of literature that says the human body is fundamental. The way we acquire knowledge is, the human body plays a fundamental role. And none of this is being captured in this sort of idea that we can create super intelligent humans or super intelligent robots. All of which to say that if we're on a path and our solution is don't worry, technology is somehow going to rescue us, but it hasn't yet, I think we have to start saying, well, what happens if it doesn't rescue us and we continue on this path? What happens if we acquire the capacity to extend human life to, the kind of lengths they're talking about, but human productivity doesn't increase at that rate? Are we going to create a society of sort of serfs and aristocrats and, a very small privileged elite living off the labors of those who don't have the luxury of retiring at 65? And we see that. I see that around me in Western societies, where you see people who are working well into their retirement, having to take second jobs because their pension isn't sufficient, and in some cases physically demanding jobs that are running down their health. We're seeing widening gaps in life expectancy within Britain because of this sort of thing. So some people living the best lives and other people essentially supporting them in the style to which they've grown accustomed. And I think these are unsustainable trajectories. We have to face up to these as a society. And if we don't, I think there is a real danger that you could, and what path that goes on, I can't say, but I don't think we can just assume that we don't have to take tough decisions because somehow we're going to be rescued by a deus ex machina of technology. I think until that technology actually proves itself that it can do this, we have to err on the side of caution and I think begin confronting these decisions now. And in Western societies, I see very little of that. I see a lot of, either dooms, on the one hand, there's sort of the doom mongers, and on the other hand, the optimists, but not someone in the middle saying, well, we have the capacity to do it, but we have to have the will and make the decisions. And, I'm hearing very little of that, certainly in political discourse and even in journalistic discourse. Whether or not other societies are more open to that task, that's a possibility. But that is a concern of mine, that we could just sort of end up in denial, not facing with any of, not dealing with any of these issues while things, and certainly to listen to my colleagues in climate science, it gets worse by the year. And I'm guilty of this myself sometimes. And I focus on all the benefits of the energy transition. But when you look at the aggregate data, yes, we're electrifying the world economy and shifting to renewables very quickly. But our aggregate consumption of fossil fuels still keeps going up, because growth is rising faster than the transition can keep up. And is that sustainable? Well, according to my colleagues in climate science, no. And we're getting very close to a crunch point. And yet, I hear in Canada, you can have wildfires, bringing the economy to a halt. And people still talk about how, don't worry, next season will be better. And sort of like my hope for Manchester United. At some point, you have to say, well, you're not going to be rescued by a new signing. I think that's the main thing I would say, is that I wouldn't say I'm pessimistic, because I'm not. But I think for the first time, I'm really starting to say we may really have been the beneficiaries of an extraordinary time in human history, but that might not be the model for all human history. And maybe we should actually take a step back and think of, do we need real deeper imagination?
John, Peter, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've followed your work besides the book that I've read recently, and Peter, I've read your book on Christendom as well. I've read both of your works in Unheard and various other media outlets. So the listeners, the watchers, know where to go to find you. What can we expect from you, and where can we find you in the dark corners of the internet?
I think in both our cases, honestly, if anybody just Googles our names, quickly come up with a list of our publications and our various outlets. I mean, I write, obviously, as you just referenced, John. I write regularly. I'm a contributor for Unheard. I also write a weekly column in the business pages of a Canadian newspaper called the Globe and Mail, all of which I post on my LinkedIn page. And but beyond that, as I say, I think, and you just do the same with Peter. If you put Peter Heather's name in a Google search, you come up with no shortage of stuff to read. And if it were up to me, I leave it to Peter to say, but if it were up to me, I'd say I think always start with his book on the fall of the Roman Empire, because it's relatively short and accessible and easy. And then that will open your mind to, I think, probably with the books that you would probably want to be defined by, Peter. I would think sort of some of your later works on where you really go beyond the empire to look at the periphery. And that's where it gets very interesting, including Christendom. But what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, the running theme in everything I've done is actually the way in which relationship with more developed societies alters less developed societies. I realized that about 15 years in. It took me a while to realize that that's what interested me, but it is what interests me. And the Christianity book is a a very particular expansion of that application of that idea, I suppose, in a sense. But that is what interests me, and just, you know, wouldn't want anyone to be holding their breath, but I'm now working on Vikings with that dimension in mind as well. Yeah, I'm having great fun working with a guy who's the curator of the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, and because this is, well, it comes back to John's reflection in a sense, because what's not really noticed about the Viking period is that Scandinavians had been using waterborne transport for 3,000 years before the Viking Age, but they get sails exactly when the Viking Age begins. So technology is behind the whole range of Viking phenomena, because without sails, we don't have it. So that's where the new stuff is going. Sorry, excuse me.
Okay, well, hopefully I'm not cutting you off, Peter. I know you're having a drink of water there, but we'll close out there. You're both being very generous with your time. Nothing else to say. Yeah. I've talked you into a submission. Well, thanks both for coming on. I'm looking forward to seeing what else you produce, and it'll be great to have you on in the future.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having us, and we'd always be happy to come and talk.
Well, enjoy your travels. Take care, guys. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.